So the Russians have a problem because they are desperate for recruits, and they have been using people in the Donbas essentially as cannon fodder. They create this Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic armed forces, which are nominally different to the Russian armed forces, but in fact they're under the command of them. And they've just had to recruit as many people as they can, and they don't have very good vetting procedures for taking people in at that low level. But they will probably be aware, the partisans are being hunted all the time by the FSB, and they will be aware that is a possibility of some infiltration. So the National Resistance Movement is a group of partisans who are operating in a wide area across occupied Ukraine, spanning from the Kherson region all the way down to Mariupol, but they're predominantly active in the Zaporizhia region, where the counteroffensive is focusing on at the moment. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge support for Ukraine in the south of Ukraine. This is traditionally like Ukrainian-speaking rural areas which have not the same ties with Russia as parts of the Donbas or Crimea. And, we saw from the beginning of the war, when Kherson was occupied by the Russians, there were large pro-Ukrainian demonstrations that the Russians had to disperse. So the fact that the partisans are able to recruit both active people who are willing to act as combatants and kind of passive supporters who pass them information or just know about them but without sharing information with the Russians, testifies to the strength of support that they have in that area. I think we're still in the early stages of the counteroffensive, but we are seeing that partisans have a huge impact on the way that the war is being fought. They are providing targets for the Ukrainian forces to hit with long-range weaponry such as the Storm Shadows supplied by Britain. And they are in fact going out and blowing up strategic bridges and ammunition depots and things like that themselves, so they're also taking on an active role. And by identifying these really strategic targets, they play a really important role in contributing to Ukraine's counteroffensive and limiting Russia's ability to respond quickly. I mean, even the small things they do, like scattering tyre spikes across roads at night, will delay and slow down and cause problems for the Russians. So the partisans are highly secretive because obviously their life depends on staying below the radar. And they spoke to me without faces, and they didn't want their recordings to be used. But they are in touch constantly with Ukraine's military intelligence, who provide them with objectives and information, and the partisans pass this information back as well. And because I've worked in Ukraine for more than a decade, I have good contacts in Ukrainian intelligence that I built up over time. And we have a working relationship where they felt that they could trust me to give some of this information without revealing too many details that could identify the partisans. And the reason they wanted to speak out now is because ahead of the main thrust of the counteroffensive, which is still to come, they wanted to recruit as many partisans to their cause as possible, and they believed that sharing this article and having translations of this article both would help them recruit partisans in Ukraine, but also demonstrate to the partisans who are already fighting for Ukraine that they have Western support and sympathy and interest. So Operation Dmitry is a very long and complex operation, basically for the Russian army infiltration. So the Ukrainian partisans were hoping to infiltrate the Russian army by taking a volunteer to their partisan movement who had no previous background. A lot of the partisans might have served in the Ukrainian military or have expressed some pro-Ukrainian sentiment on Facebook or other social media, and so they looked for and found quite a young lad from Donbas who didn't have any ideological posts or any kind of hint that he had any pro-Ukrainian leanings, and he went and joined the Russian military, was sent for 2 months to Rostov-on-Don, and when he returned from that, he was assigned to a staging post where the Russian soldiers are then distributed to different units, and there are senior officers at that staging post. And it wasn't something that they had necessarily planned. They'd wanted him to infiltrate and get information, but they didn't know how they would use that information. But when he said, I'm on a base with kind of 600 recruits and very senior officers, including colonels, they decided that it was an opportunity that was too good to pass up, and they wanted to hit that base with long-range HIMARS missiles. And they had a difficult discussion about this because obviously the only way they could hit that target was while he was still on base and sending them coordinates. There was no way for him as a Russian private to leave the base. So he had to make a decision to share with them the coordinates, knowing that it was going to be hit by HIMARS missiles. And after that happened, they lost contact with him for 3 days, and they were obviously worried that he had died. But in fact, he managed to escape by just in time. He was running away. The first missile came in, it hit his fellow conscripts, and he was running away and got caught in the blast, but wasn't injured too badly. So he's now a Russian military man, and the Russians don't know that he's a double agent, as it were. So he has been recovering in a Russian field hospital, and the Ukrainian military intelligence expect that he will continue to serve and provide them with information. They were very cagey about providing details of this operation to me, and we had a long back and forth about, I can't really tell your story unless you give me some kind of interesting details about a character-driven story. So they revealed some of this to me, and then it was a kind of long back and forth about how to get enough of information about Dmitry in order to tell the story. And they felt that this was a compromise. We didn't say exactly when the HIMARS attack was, or exactly where the HIMARS attack was. They felt they had given enough information to tell the story, but not enough to reveal him, because several people were injured in that attack. So the Russians have a problem because they are desperate for recruits, and they have been using people in the Donbas. Essentially as cannon fodder. They create this Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic armed forces, which are nominally different to the Russian armed forces, but in fact they're under the command of them. And they've just had to recruit as many people as they can, and they don't have very good vetting procedures for taking people in at that low level. But they will probably be aware, the Partisans are being hunted all the time by the FSB, and they will be aware that is a possibility of some infiltration. And one of the things that was difficult about this story is that we'll publish it, and then the Russians won't know that for sure that they've been infiltrated, and they will be looking for these people. But I think the Partisans also think that it's probably no bad thing if the Russians are second-guessing every person that they recruit from the Donbas. So Wagner has posed a problem for Russia now that Wagner is not on the battlefield in Ukraine, and somehow Russia needs to fill that gap. And it's already aware that it has taken huge casualties and needs to recruit. So there is a constant recruitment drive, mostly conscription at this stage in Russia, but they're obviously very happy to take on volunteers as well. So there isn't at that level of recruitment posts, there isn't much questioning of background. So Ukraine's advances so far in the counteroffensive have been small. This is because they are testing the waters, they're probing Russian defences, they're checking which points in the line might be vulnerable, seeing how Russia responds. And what Ukraine really wants to do at this point in the counteroffensive is draw out Russian reserves so that they can destroy them with precision munitions. So because Ukraine doesn't have air superiority, it's not comfortable sending huge columns against the Russian front lines because it can't protect them from air power. So it's continuing this kind of small-scale attacks, see how the Russian responds, and try and destroy Russian units as they do respond. And until I think they feel that they've drawn out enough of the Russian reserves and destroyed them, they're not going to commit their main assault force. And so one of the reasons the Partisans wanted to have these interviews now is that they want to recruit ahead of the main thrust of the counteroffensive. So they're obviously very much expecting to see a much bigger drive towards the Russian lines in the coming weeks. We don't know roughly, and that's not something they're going to share because obviously they don't want the Russians to know where or when it's coming. And it will also probably be flexible. It depends on the Russian response. So if the Russians do suddenly start committing large reserves to an area, they might decide that they will then attack in a different area. So they're going to be adapting their tactics all the time. So they might have a plan of how they do it, but they're probably not going to know exactly when it will be. I mean, we talked about a spring offensive, now we talked about a summer offensive, and even in these interviews with the Ukrainian military intelligence that they were saying, look, this isn't going to be weeks, it's going to go well into autumn, so we don't know quite how it will look for now. It's very difficult to predict whether we will see another Kherson-style liberation as we saw last summer. I think everyone wants to see that. Everyone is excited by the prospect, but the kind of the biggest towns, Berdyansk and Mariupol, are still very far away from the fighting is taking place. Melitopol would also be another important victory for Ukraine, and perhaps they can get there this summer, and that will probably be part of the ambition. but it's going to be a much more difficult fight than Kherson. The logistical supply routes for Russia to Melitopol are overland. They don't have to cross a huge river. It's going to be much harder to drive them out, and they've fortified their defences very heavily. Well, landmines will compromise Ukraine's counter-offensive. That's the point of them, is to block large movements of armour towards the Russian positions. Ukraine already has engineering battalions, and they have engineering techniques and training provided by the West in order to deal with landmines. We've seen early on in the counter-offensive that they were posing a real problem to one particular brigade, but that brigade had really advanced quite recklessly into a minefield and has taken a lot of criticism for that. And I think we expect to see Ukraine acting more cautiously. They have a lot of equipment. They can always have more equipment to help them kind of plough ways through minefields to explode mines. There are line charges that they can use. Those things are in place. I think the greatest problem still for Ukraine is that they don't have aerial superiority, and that is something that poses a real challenge to large movements of armour on the battlefield.